The night was colder than usual, and the city lights glowed against the dark sky like distant stars that could never be reached. On a narrow sidewalk, surrounded by tall buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly, a man sat hunched forward on a piece of cardboard. His arms were wrapped around his knees, his head bent low, and his breath came out in faint clouds that disappeared as quickly as they formed. He had no blanket to protect himself, no roof to hide under, and no certainty about whether tomorrow would bring food or more hunger. He was nameless to the people walking by, invisible to the endless traffic, and forgotten by the city that never slept. Once, he had been like everyone else who hurried through those same streets with bags of groceries, briefcases, and dreams of tomorrow. He had worn clean clothes, had a small apartment with creaky floors, and a job that paid just enough to keep him afloat. But life had ways of breaking even the strongest. A lost job, a failed business attempt, and debts piling higher than he could manage slowly pushed him toward the edge. Friends who promised to help disappeared one by one until there was no one left to call. What began as one missed rent payment became an eviction notice, and what began as one unpaid bill grew into a mountain of financial weight he could no longer carry. Now, as he sat on that cardboard sheet, the world passed him by with indifference. Some people turned their heads away, pretending not to notice him. Others glanced quickly, perhaps with pity, but not long enough to stop. The truth was simple. In a city filled with millions of people, being homeless made you invisible. He was no longer someone with a name, a past, or a future. He was just another figure in the shadows of the towering buildings. But even in the stillness of that night, there was something inside him that refused to die. It was not hope in its brightest form, but a small ember that flickered faintly in his chest. He told himself again and again that this was not the end. He still had his mind, his hands, and the ability to learn. No matter how low he had fallen, no matter how invisible the world made him feel, he believed that if he could survive this darkness, he could one day find the light again. The hunger gnawed at his stomach like an enemy he could not defeat. Days blurred together, each one a repetition of searching for food in trash bins, standing in line at shelters and trying to find corners where the cold wind would not bite as sharply. Yet the harshness of life on the streets became a strange kind of teacher. It stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving behind only the essence of survival and the importance of resilience. He discovered that even when you have nothing, you still have choices. You can give up or you can fight in whatever way you can. On some mornings, when the sun peeked between the skyscrapers, he would watch people rushing to work and imagine himself walking among them again, carrying a briefcase, stepping into an office, and being treated with dignity. It seemed impossible, like a dream too far from reach. Yet he clung to that image because it gave him strength to get through the day. What kept him moving was not just survival, but the memory of his past self. He remembered the boy who used to take apart radios to see how they worked, the teenager who could spend hours on a computer, curious about how lines of code could create something out of nothing. That curiosity had never left him. It lived quietly inside, even as his hands grew cold and his stomach empty. One evening, snowflakes drifted down from the sky, covering the streets in soft white. The man found himself drawn to the warmth of a public library. He stepped inside, more for shelter than for books, but the moment he felt the heat and saw rows upon rows of knowledge, something shifted inside him. He wandered between shelves, his fingers brushing against spines of books that promised worlds far larger than his own reality. He picked up one about computers and another about entrepreneurship. He sat at a corner table, the warmth of the heater on his face, and began to read. That night, something lit up in his heart. He realized that even though he had lost everything, the one thing he still had was the ability to learn. No one could take that from him. As he read about innovators who had built empires from nothing, he felt a strange connection. They had faced struggles too, different perhaps, but struggles nonetheless. If they could rise, why not him? From that day on, the library became his secret refuge. Each time he stepped inside, he carried away not just knowledge, but hope. He filled pages of a notebook with ideas, sketches of computer systems, app concepts, and fragments of dreams that seemed ridiculous at the time. He had no money, no office, no partner, but he had vision. And vision was a seed, small at first, but capable of growing into something larger than life. Of course, reality never gave him the luxury of forgetting where he was. Nights were still spent on sidewalks, curled against the cold with the city noises echoing in his ears. Days still began with the ache of hunger, Yet within him there was a quiet war being fought. The world tried to tell him he was finished, that he was nothing more than a failure sitting on cardboard. But his mind whispered something different. This was only a chapter, not the ending. There were moments when he doubted himself, when the hunger was too sharp, or when he watched others succeed while he remained stuck in the shadows. The ember of hope seemed ready to fade. But then he would open his notebook and read the words he had written, the ideas he had dreamed, and he would remind himself that even if no one else believed in him, he had to believe in himself. In those long nights, he also learned something about people. He saw cruelty in those who mocked or ignored him, but he also saw kindness in strangers who offered a sandwich or a cup of coffee. Those small acts reminded him that humanity was not lost, and that one day, if he ever found his way back up, he would repay that kindness 1,000 times over. The city that seemed so heartless during the day transformed at night. The glow of skyscraper lights, the endless hum of cars, and the quiet snowfall created a backdrop that almost felt cinematic. And sitting there in the middle of it, he often wondered if maybe, just maybe, his story was only beginning. Perhaps fate had taken everything from him not to destroy him, but to rebuild him into someone stronger. He promised himself that one day he would stand tall again. One day he would not just walk into those shining towers of glass as a visitor, but as someone who belonged there. He did not know how or when, but he knew why. The why was survival, dignity, and the chance to prove to himself that he was more than his failures. As another night deepened and the snow thickened on the sidewalks, he closed his eyes and imagined a future where he was no longer invisible, a future where his story of loss and pain would one day be told as a story of resilience and victory. A future where he would rise from rock bottom and build something that mattered. And so, though he had nothing to his name, he carried with him the one thing that no amount of failure could erase, the unbreakable will to keep moving forward. The cold mornings never grew easier, but each day the man forced himself to rise from the piece of cardboard that had become both his bed and his prison. The streets were never kind and hunger followed him like a shadow, yet something had changed inside. That evening, when he first stepped into the library, had left him with more than warmth. It had given him a glimpse of what his life could still become. He began to see the library not just as a place to escape the cold, but as a door into another world. Every time he entered, he felt as though he had crossed a line that separated misery from possibility. Surrounded by shelves of knowledge, he was reminded that the human mind was limitless if only one was willing to learn. He started spending hours in that place, his hands turning the worn pages of books on technology, business, and self-improvement. He devoured stories about men and women who had built something out of nothing. They too had known hardship. Some had lived in poverty. Some had been rejected countless times, yet they found ways to keep going. As he read, he no longer saw himself as the man sitting on a sidewalk with nothing. He began to picture himself as someone in the middle of his story, waiting for the chapter that would turn everything around. He told himself that knowledge was the only possession no one could steal from him, and he clung to it with all his strength. He scribbled notes in an old notebook he had salvaged from a donation box. Its pages quickly filled with sketches of app designs, ideas for digital platforms, and outlines of services that could change the way people worked. He had no computer to test these ideas, no internet access beyond the limited time on the library's old machines. But still his thoughts raced faster than his circumstances could contain. Sometimes, when hunger made it hard to think, he would just sit quietly in the warm library corner, staring at the notes he had written, reminding himself that even broken beginnings could lead to powerful futures. The spark of hope became stronger when he discovered free online tutorials. It was not easy. He had to wait in long lines to use a computer, and often the session would end before he could finish a single lesson. Still, he persisted. He typed slowly at first, struggling to make sense of the codes flashing across the screen. But night after night, lesson after lesson, it began to make sense. The first time he managed to create a simple program that worked, his heart pounded with pride. It was small, almost laughable by industry standards, but to him it was proof that he was not broken beyond repair. He could learn, he could build, and he could still contribute something meaningful to the world. Of course, reality did not pause to applaud his small victories. He still woke up to aching bones, still searched for food, and still endured the stares of strangers who dismissed him as nothing. But now there was a difference in the way he carried himself. His eyes no longer looked only at the ground. They sometimes looked toward the horizon. He began to believe that he was not defined by the present moment, but by the potential of what he could become. He started talking less about what he had lost and more about what he could create. To the few people he spoke to in shelters, he shared ideas about technology, business, and building solutions for the future. Many laughed, thinking it was nothing more than the fantasy of a man broken by hardship, but inside he knew his vision was real. He reminded himself that almost every great idea in history began as something others doubted. One evening, as he sat on a bench outside the library with his notebook open on his lap, he felt a sudden clarity. The city around him was alive with lights and sounds, cars racing past, people hurrying home, and offices glowing with workers still at their desks. He realized that technology was at the center of it all. The traffic lights, the glowing billboards, the offices filled with computers, it was everywhere, shaping lives every second. If he could create something valuable within this world of technology, then he could not only change his own life, but also improve the lives of others. That thought burned brighter than hunger, stronger than cold. But knowing the path and walking it were two different things. He needed more than ideas. He needed resources, tools, and opportunities. With this in mind, he began taking on small tasks wherever he could find them. He washed dishes at a diner in exchange for a meal. He cleaned offices late at night, mopping floors while staring at the computer screens that employees had left behind. Each coin he earned was saved, not wasted, because he knew that eventually even small coins could add up to something greater. He dreamed of saving enough for a used laptop even if it took months. Days turned into weeks, and slowly his determination became visible. He no longer walked with his shoulders slumped, but with purpose in his step. People who had once ignored him began to notice his persistence. A librarian, seeing his constant presence, quietly extended his computer sessions whenever possible. A fellow man at the shelter, intrigued by his endless note-taking, gave him a pen when his own ran dry. These small acts of kindness fueled his resolve. It reminded him that though he was fighting his battle alone, the world sometimes sent quiet allies along the way. One night, after leaving the library, he sat under a street lamp reading his notes. Snowflakes fell around him, melting against the warm glow of the light. In that still moment, he closed his eyes and imagined himself standing tall in front of a large office building, holding a briefcase, walking inside not as an outsider but as the owner. He could almost hear the applause of employees, the recognition of peers, the satisfaction of proving to himself that he had never truly been defeated. That vision was no longer just a dream. It was a promise he made to himself. The spark of hope had grown into something more powerful. It was no longer a faint ember, but the beginning of a flame that could not be ignored. He knew that the journey ahead would be filled with obstacles, rejection, and countless nights of doubt. But he also knew that the man sitting on cardboard was not his final identity. He was a student of life, a builder of ideas, and a future creator of something far greater than the world could yet see. As the city roared around him, the man smiled faintly to himself. The library had given him warmth, but knowledge had given him something much greater, the belief that he was not trapped forever. He carried that spark like a hidden treasure, determined to protect it, nurture it, and one day let it grow into a fire bright enough to change his destiny. And so in the quiet of that snowy night, the man who had nothing but a notebook and a dream whispered to himself that this was only the beginning. The morning air was sharp, carrying with it the chill of winter that made every breath feel heavy. The man rose slowly from his corner of the street, brushing the frost off his jacket. His body was tired, his stomach nearly empty, but his heart carried something it had not carried before. The certainty that change would only come if he forced it to. Reading books in the library and sketching ideas in a notebook gave him vision, but vision alone could not keep him warm or fed. If he wanted to climb out of the hole life had buried him in, he needed to take the first step, however small it seemed. He began searching for work, not the kind of grand job that would change everything overnight, but anything that could put coins in his hand and food in his stomach. He scoured the city streets, asking shopkeepers, cafe owners, and small businesses if they needed help. Most shook their heads or turned him away, but he refused to stop asking. At last he found a diner that needed someone to wash dishes during late-night hours. The pay was little more than scraps, but to him, it was the start of something greater. He rolled up his sleeves and worked tirelessly, his hands raw from soap and hot water, his back sore from standing for hours. Yet he welcomed the pain because it meant he was earning. Each night when his shift ended, he left with more than a few dollars. He left with the knowledge that he was moving forward. He tucked away most of his earnings into a small envelope, saving every cent with the goal of buying a second-hand laptop one day. He spent the remaining coins on simple meals, nothing more than bread or a bowl of soup, but it was enough to keep him going. The hunger that once consumed him began to ease, replaced by determination. After work, he would head to the community center, where free internet access was offered to those who needed it. The old computers there were slow and crowded, but he made use of every minute. He studied coding, clicking through tutorials until the center closed its doors. At first, the codes and commands seemed like a foreign language, an endless sea of symbols and numbers. But night after night, lesson after lesson, he began to understand. The first time his screen lit up with a small program he had built himself, he felt a thrill stronger than any meal could provide. Progress came slowly, but he refused to be discouraged. He told himself that building knowledge was like laying bricks. One day's work did not create a house, but if he kept adding bricks, if he kept stacking them carefully, eventually he would build something solid. Whenever doubt crept in, he reminded himself that the same men and women who had built tech empires had once been beginners too. They had typed their first lines of code, struggled with mistakes, and pushed through frustration. If they could learn, so could he. The days turned into weeks, and his confidence grew. He started to design small applications in his notebook, imagining tools that could help businesses organize their tasks, track their customers, or manage their data more efficiently. He sketched screens and wrote down functions, even though he had no device of his own yet. In his mind, the ideas were alive, waiting only for the moment when he could bring them to life on a computer. Still, he faced rejection. When he approached small companies with his early sketches, many laughed at the idea of trusting someone who had no degree, no office, and no reputation. He walked away from those conversations with a heavy heart, but he refused to let rejection break him. Instead, he used it as fuel. Every no became a lesson. Every dismissal sharpened his vision. He went back to his notes, improved his ideas, and strengthened his skills. One night while working at the diner, he overheard a customer complaining about the difficulties of managing employee schedules. The business owner spoke of how confusing it was to track shifts on paper and how mistakes often caused frustration. As he listened quietly, the man realized he could create a program to solve that exact problem. The thought stayed with him all night, and by morning, he had sketched an outline of what would become his first true project, a simple scheduling app. From then on, every moment outside of work was devoted to this idea. He borrowed more books from the library, studied coding languages late into the night, and tested prototypes whenever he had access to a computer. The app was crude at first, full of errors and glitches, but he kept refining it. Every failure taught him something new, and every improvement gave him hope that one day this program might find its way into the hands of real businesses. The breakthrough came when one of the librarians, who had watched him spend countless hours learning, asked about the notes he always carried. When he explained his project, she was impressed by his persistence. She connected him with a friend who owned a small print shop and was willing to try his scheduling tool. It was not a glamorous client, nor was there any large payment, but for him it was everything. It was proof that his work had value. He worked side by side with the print shop owner, fixing bugs, adding features, and tailoring the program to their needs. For the first time, someone outside himself believed in his creation. When the shop owner handed him a modest payment, the man held it as though it were a treasure. It was not just money. It was validation. It was the first step from being invisible to being seen again. With renewed energy, he returned to his nightly shifts and his studies, knowing that this was only the beginning. He could feel momentum building like a tide slowly rising. He was no longer just a man on a sidewalk with a notebook of ideas. He was a builder, a creator, and soon he would be more. That night, as he left the diner and walked past the tall skyscrapers, he stopped and looked up at the glowing windows. He whispered to himself that one day, he would not just stare at those buildings from the outside. One day he would walk into one of them as the founder of something that mattered. The world had taken much from him, but it could not take his will to keep moving. The first step had been taken, And though the road ahead was still long and uncertain, he carried with him the fire of belief that no obstacle could extinguish. The first step had given him confidence, but the road beyond it was filled with shadows he could not ignore. For every small victory, there seemed to be 3 new obstacles waiting to test his will. He had created a working tool for the print shop, and for the first time someone paid him for his ideas. That moment had felt like the world opening its doors, yet what followed reminded him that success was never handed freely. It had to be fought for, and more often than not, it came covered in rejection. He began approaching small businesses with the hope that they too might use his scheduling program. Armed with his notebook and a fire in his chest, he walked into shops, cafes, and local offices, explaining how his software could save time and reduce confusion. Most listened politely before shaking their heads. Others dismissed him with hardly a glance. Some even laughed, questioning how a man with no company, no polished background, and no team could possibly deliver what larger firms already promised. Each rejection pressed against him like a heavy stone, threatening to crush the fragile flame of hope he carried. There were days he walked back to the shelter with his shoulders heavy, his notebook pressed tightly to his chest as though he feared it would be stolen. At night, lying on the thin cot or sometimes back on the cold pavement when the shelter was full, he would stare upward and ask himself if he was chasing a dream too big for someone like him. The voice of doubt was loud and cruel, whispering that he was nothing but a failure trying to dress himself in the clothes of success. But each morning, he forced himself to rise again. He told himself that if he gave up now, then the nights of hunger, the bruised hands from endless work, and the hours spent learning in the library would all be wasted. He decided he would rather fail 1,000 times than give up once. So he pressed on, returning to the community center computers, refining his code, and reading more about business. He studied how great companies had been built, how leaders had overcome setbacks, and how persistence had turned rejection into opportunity. He began to see rejection not as a wall but as a teacher. Each no revealed something missing. Sometimes his product was too rough, sometimes his pitch too unclear, sometimes his presentation too unpolished. He began making adjustments, learning from the very people who turned him away. Even so, there were moments when the weight of failure broke through his defenses. One afternoon, after being rejected by a small office for the 10th time that week, he sat alone on the steps of a building, staring at the city that towered above him. His envelope of savings was still far from enough to buy his own laptop, and his progress felt painfully slow. He thought about walking away, about finding a steady job that would keep him alive even if it meant killing his dream. But deep inside, he knew he could never be satisfied with just survival. He wanted to build, to create, to prove that the man who had once slept on cardboard could rise to heights unimaginable. It was during this low point that he encountered one of the harshest rejections of all. A potential client invited him to present his idea to a small group of business owners. He stayed up all night preparing, perfecting his pitch, rehearsing every word until his throat was sore. He walked into the room with trembling hands but determined eyes. Yet, as he spoke, he could see the disinterest spreading across their faces. When he finished, one of them chuckled and said, "You're not ready. Come back when you're serious." The words cut him deeper than any hunger ever had. That night, he did not return to the shelter. He wandered the streets, his notebook heavy in his hand, his heart even heavier in his chest. He sat on a bench under the flickering light of a street lamp, wondering if all his efforts had been foolish. He opened his notebook and stared at the pages filled with lines of code, sketches of applications, and endless notes. For a moment, the temptation to tear it all apart filled his mind, but then he remembered the first spark of joy when his program had worked, the first payment from the print shop, and the vision of himself walking into those tall buildings with dignity. Slowly, the despair lifted, replaced by the stubborn belief that failure was not the end but part of the path. He made a promise to himself under that street lamp. Every failure he faced would be turned into fuel. Every rejection would sharpen his skills. Every doubt would be drowned out by action. If the world did not believe in him yet, he would continue until they had no choice but to see. The next day, he returned to the library, his eyes sharper, his mind steadier. He read not only about coding but also about design, marketing, and communication. He realized that building a product was only half the battle. The other half was learning how to present it in a way people could understand and trust. He began practicing how he spoke, how he carried himself, how to explain his ideas without overwhelming others. He transformed not just his skills but his presence. It was not an overnight change. Failure still followed him, sometimes cruelly, sometimes quietly, but each time it came, he was ready. He no longer saw himself as the man being defeated. He saw himself as the man learning through fire. The world could laugh, dismiss, or ignore him, but he would not stop. He told himself again and again that no empire was ever built without bricks of rejection. No success story ever existed without chapters of defeat. And so he kept moving, one rejection at a time, one lesson at a time, slowly shaping himself into the man he was determined to become. As he stood on another street corner one night, looking at the skyscrapers glowing against the sky, he whispered to himself that these failures would one day become the foundation of his triumph. He did not know how long it would take, or how much more he would have to endure. But he knew with absolute certainty that the man the world saw as broken would one day stand as unshakable proof that persistence could turn failure into destiny. The weight of rejection had become familiar, almost like an unwelcome companion that followed him wherever he went. Yet despite the sting, he no longer feared it. Failure had shaped him, sharpened him, and though it bruised his spirit many times, it never broke him completely. Deep inside, he held on to one truth. Every no meant he was closer to a yes. And then, when the moment finally came, it arrived quietly, without fanfare, without grand lights, but it carried with it the seed of transformation that would alter his life forever. One evening, while working at the diner scrubbing pots until his fingers ached, a customer seated at the counter began a conversation with the manager. The man, weary but always listening, caught words about small businesses struggling to manage their customer records and how complicated existing software had become. Something inside him stirred. He had written about this exact problem in his notebook, and he knew he had already been experimenting with solutions. He hesitated at first, unsure if speaking up would lead to ridicule, but he reminded himself that silence had never changed anything. When the customer finished his meal and prepared to leave, the man wiped his hands quickly, nerves pounding in his chest, and approached him. With a polite but shaky voice, he introduced himself and explained that he had been working on an idea to simplify data management for small businesses. He expected dismissal. Instead, the customer raised an eyebrow, intrigued. They exchanged a few words, and to his astonishment, the man asked if he would be willing to show a prototype. That night, long after his shift ended, he sat in the library with his notebook open, heart racing with both fear and excitement. This was the chance he had been waiting for, the moment that could justify all the nights spent in the cold, all the hours bent over borrowed computers. He worked with relentless focus, polishing his code, sketching clean designs, preparing every detail he could. His body screamed for rest, but his mind was alive, burning with the knowledge that this could be his first real break. When he finally met the small business owner to present his work, he walked in with nothing more than his notebook and a borrowed laptop the librarian had graciously allowed him to use. His hands trembled as he demonstrated how the tool worked, how it simplified the process, how it could save both time and cost. The owner leaned forward, genuinely impressed by the clarity of his solution. Unlike so many before, this man did not laugh, did not dismiss. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "This could actually work." Hearing those words was like breathing fresh air after years underwater. For the first time, someone outside himself saw the potential in his ideas. The business owner agreed to try his system on a trial basis. It was not a contract worth millions, not even thousands, but it was a door finally opening. The following weeks were filled with sleepless nights. He worked tirelessly to refine the program, fixing bugs, adding features, and responding to every need the business had. He answered calls at odd hours, sometimes walking miles to find a working phone at the shelter or a borrowed internet connection. He gave everything he had because this was not just a client, it was validation. And slowly word began to spread. The business owner recommended him to a friend, then another. Soon he had a small cluster of businesses using his software. Each one brought in a modest payment, but combined, they gave him something priceless: momentum. With the money he earned, he finally reached the goal he had been saving toward for months. He purchased a second-hand laptop. Holding it in his hands felt surreal, as though he had just claimed a weapon in his battle against the world. No longer limited to library hours or borrowed machines, he now had the freedom to create whenever inspiration struck. That night, sitting in the shelter with his laptop glowing softly in the dim light, he whispered to himself that this was the beginning of something much larger. He expanded his program, learning how to make it more professional, more appealing, more functional. Every time he delivered an update, his clients marveled at his dedication. They knew he worked alone without a team or funding, and yet he delivered solutions faster than companies with entire departments. His hunger for growth was unmatched, and it showed in his work. But the true breakthrough came when one of his clients, impressed by both the software and the man's unrelenting spirit, introduced him to a local entrepreneur known for investing in small ventures. The meeting was arranged in a modest cafe, and he arrived early, laptop in hand, heart thundering. He knew this was his chance to step onto a bigger stage. The entrepreneur listened carefully as he presented his work. Unlike the dismissive stares he had grown used to, this man's eyes held curiosity. He asked tough questions, probing for weaknesses, testing the resilience of both the idea and the man behind it. The homeless dreamer answered each one with honesty, passion, and conviction, explaining not only what the program was but what it could become. He painted a vision of how technology could empower small businesses everywhere, how simplicity could be more powerful than complexity, and how one idea could ripple across industries. By the time he finished, the entrepreneur leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," he said. And with those words, he offered him his first real investment. The amount was not enormous, but to the man who once had nothing, it was a fortune. It gave him the means to rent a tiny room instead of sleeping on sidewalks, to buy better equipment, and to dedicate himself fully to building his dream. For the first time, he felt what it was like to stand not as a beggar for opportunities, but as a creator being given a chance to prove himself. With every ounce of strength, he threw himself into his work. He coded day and night, built new features, and created a vision for how his company could grow. He no longer carried only a notebook filled with sketches. He now had a product in the hands of real users, an investor who believed in him, and the beginnings of a reputation. That was the true breakthrough. Not just the investment, not just the clients, but the shift within himself. He was no longer the man defined by hunger and rejection. He was the man rising, the man building, the man stepping into the future he had dreamed of on countless cold nights. The empire was still far away, but its foundation had finally been laid, and as he stood outside that night looking at the same skyscrapers that had once mocked his pain, he smiled. For the first time, he did not see them as unreachable towers. He saw them as the walls of a world he was now beginning to enter. The breakthrough had opened a door, but stepping through it was only the beginning. What waited beyond was a road that demanded more sacrifice, more energy, and more faith than anything he had endured before. With a small investment behind him, a second-hand laptop at his side, and a few clients already trusting his work, he no longer felt invisible. For the first time in years, he woke each morning not to survive but to build. The man who had once sat on sidewalks with nothing now sat at a small desk in a rented room, surrounded by scribbled notes, glowing screens, and an unshakable belief that his dream was no longer just a dream. It was becoming reality. The room was barely furnished, a thin bed, a chair, and a wooden desk scarred with scratches. But to him, it felt like a palace. It was warm, private, and most importantly, it gave him a place to focus. He worked from sunrise until long after midnight, stopping only to grab quick meals or stretch his aching hands. His life revolved around one thing, turning his software into something too valuable to ignore. He pored over every detail. He improved the user interface so that even people with little computer knowledge could navigate it with ease. He added new features based on feedback, carefully listening to every complaint and every suggestion from his clients. When a customer said it was too slow, he rewrote sections of code. When another wanted a different layout, he stayed up all night redesigning it. He had no team, no employees, no one to delegate tasks to, yet his dedication was so relentless that it felt as if he worked with the energy of 10 men. As his product grew stronger, so did his reputation. Word of mouth spread quickly. Small businesses began contacting him, asking about the software they had heard others praising. Each new client meant more income, but it also meant more responsibility. He faced challenges he had never imagined, supporting multiple customers at once, managing deadlines, handling payments, and trying to look professional despite having no real company structure. There were nights when the pressure nearly broke him, but each morning he rose again, reminding himself that this was the life he had begged for when he had nothing. Pressure was a privilege. The entrepreneur who had first invested in him noticed his progress and offered guidance. He introduced him to others in the business world, opening doors that once would have been locked tight. In meetings, the man still wore simple clothes, often out of place among polished suits, but what he lacked in appearance he made up for in passion. When he spoke about his software, about the vision of empowering small businesses with simple tools, people listened. They could see in his eyes the fire of someone who had lived through the darkest nights and still refused to quit. Soon, he was no longer just a freelancer with a few clients. He was a founder. He registered a company, gave it a name, and began to dream bigger. He rented a small office space, nothing more than 2 rooms with bare walls, but to him, it was a symbol. No longer did he work from borrowed corners or noisy shelters. This was his space, his headquarters, the birthplace of a dream that would grow into something larger than himself. With an office came the next step: hiring. It was not easy to trust others after years of fighting alone, but he knew he could not build an empire single-handedly. He carefully selected a few people, individuals who believed in his vision and were willing to work for modest pay in exchange for the chance to be part of something meaningful. Together they formed the first team, small but determined. He treated them with respect, remembering all too well the sting of being dismissed and ignored. He made sure they felt valued, listened to, and inspired. Under his leadership, the company began to grow rapidly. The software gained more recognition, expanding from small local businesses to larger clients. Investors who had once laughed at him now reached out, eager to be part of his journey. He negotiated carefully, never forgetting the humility of his beginnings, but also never selling himself short. Each deal pushed his company higher, and with each step forward, his confidence grew. Still, success was not without its storms. Competitors noticed his rising influence and tried to undercut him. Bigger companies launched similar products, attempting to crush his growing enterprise. He faced lawsuits, technical failures, and days when the servers crashed under heavy demand. Each challenge threatened to undo all he had built. But unlike before, he was no longer alone. His team rallied with him, working tirelessly to overcome every obstacle. Together, they turned setbacks into opportunities, failures into lessons, and doubts into fuel. Years passed, and the once homeless man who scribbled notes in a battered notebook now stood at the head of a thriving tech company. The office grew from 2 small rooms into entire floors of a glass building. Hundreds of employees filled the halls, all working toward the vision he had first imagined under the glow of a street lamp. His company expanded beyond the city, reaching clients across the country and eventually across the globe. What had begun as a desperate attempt to survive had transformed into a force shaping the future of technology. Despite the rapid growth, he never forgot his past. He often visited the library where he had first rediscovered hope, sitting quietly in the same corner where it all began. He donated computers to shelters and funded programs to teach coding to those who, like him, had once been dismissed as hopeless. To his employees, he spoke not only of profits and products, but also of perseverance and compassion. He reminded them that success was not measured only in money, but in the impact they created and the lives they touched. The empire he built was not just about technology. It was about proof that a man who had once been invisible could rise to be seen by the entire world, proof that resilience was stronger than rejection, proof that even from the lowest depths greatness could emerge. His name, once unknown, now appeared in newspapers, on business panels, and in award ceremonies. Yet when he looked in the mirror, he still saw the man who had once sat shivering on the cold ground. That memory never left him, and he carried it like a badge of honor. Building the empire was not a straight path. It was a road paved with sleepless nights, endless failures, and sacrifices that few would ever understand. But it was also a road that led to triumph, dignity, and the chance to rewrite his story. And as he stood one evening at the window of his office, gazing out at the city lights that once looked down on him, he realized he had done more than build a company. He had built himself anew. The day came when the man who once had nothing stood at the top of a glass tower that bore the name of the company he had built from a battered notebook and endless nights of hunger. The city stretched before him, alive with lights, cars, and voices, but for a moment all of it seemed silent as he pressed his hands against the window and remembered where he had started. The sidewalk corners, the cold nights, the whispers of failure that haunted him. They were all still there in his memory, but now they were pieces of a story that the world could no longer ignore. He had become what few believed he could ever be: a billionaire. Wealth poured into his life faster than he once thought possible. The company had grown beyond national borders, reaching markets across continents. His software was no longer just a tool for small businesses. It had evolved into a platform that powered corporations, governments, and institutions. Partnerships with global giants brought his vision into new arenas, and investors who once mocked him now competed for his attention. He had the resources to buy mansions, yachts, and private jets, but those material things did not define him. What defined him was purpose, the burning belief that money was not the end but the beginning of something greater. In boardrooms filled with polished executives, he carried himself with quiet authority. He no longer feared rejection, because he had survived the worst kind. When he spoke about innovation, people listened. When he shared his vision for the future, people invested. Yet he never let the success blind him to the faces of those who lived as he once had. He still saw the men and women sleeping under bridges, the children with empty stomachs, the dreamers with no tools to chase their dreams. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, and he vowed to spend his life making sure fewer people ever felt that way again. His first act of giving was simple. He funded technology labs in shelters and community centers, filling them with computers, internet access, and mentors who could teach coding to the homeless, the jobless, and the forgotten. He knew that knowledge had saved him when nothing else could, and he wanted others to have the same chance. For many, it was the first time they touched a keyboard, the first time they imagined themselves as creators instead of burdens. He visited those labs often, speaking to the students not as a billionaire but as one of them. He told them his story, not to boast but to prove that their circumstances did not define their destiny. From there, his efforts grew. He created scholarships for underprivileged youth, ensuring that bright minds were never wasted for lack of opportunity. He built schools in poor neighborhoods, donated laptops to rural communities, and funded global programs to spread digital literacy. He invested not only in technology but in people, in the belief that a single spark of hope could ignite a fire strong enough to change entire generations. The media loved to call him the man who rose from the streets to the stars. The homeless dreamer turned billionaire. But when reporters asked him about his success, he always redirected the conversation. "This is not about me," he would say. "It is about what can happen when we refuse to give up, when we believe in the impossible, and when we use what we have to lift others." Despite his fortune, he never forgot the small gestures that once kept him alive. The librarian who had extended his computer sessions, the stranger who handed him a sandwich on a freezing night, the business owner who gave him his first chance. Those memories stayed sharp. He reached out to each of them, thanking them personally, making sure they knew how their kindness had rippled across time to build an empire. But his greatest purpose came in shaping the culture of his own company. He insisted that employees were not just workers but dreamers. He built an environment where creativity was rewarded, where voices were heard regardless of title, and where failure was not punished but treated as a stepping stone. He encouraged his people to take risks, to innovate, to think beyond profit and toward impact. Under his leadership, the company became not just a tech giant but a symbol of resilience and humanity. Yet even as his empire soared, he kept moments of solitude to remind himself of the path he had walked. Some evenings he returned quietly to the very street corner where he once sat on cardboard. He would stand there looking at the sidewalk, remembering the cold that once seeped into his bones. Sometimes he left envelopes of money for those still struggling. Other times he simply offered words of encouragement. He knew that not everyone would rise the way he did, but he believed that every act of kindness planted a seed. As the years passed, his influence extended beyond business and philanthropy. Government sought his advice, universities invited him to speak, and leaders studied his strategies. Yet when asked how he built his empire, his answer was always the same: brick by brick, failure by failure, hope by hope. He wanted the world to understand that greatness was not born in comfort but in struggle, and that every person, no matter how broken, carried within them the power to rise. One day, standing before thousands at a global conference, he told the story of his life in the simplest words he could. He described the hunger, the cold, the rejection, and the despair. He spoke of the library, the notebook, the diner, and the moment when someone finally believed in him. The audience listened in silence, many with tears in their eyes. And when he finished, he said, "I was not special. I was not chosen. I was simply stubborn enough to keep going when the world told me to stop. If I could rise, then so can you." That was the heart of his legacy. Not the billions in his bank, not the skyscrapers with his name, not the awards that filled his office walls, but the unshakable message that hope, persistence, and vision could transform even the darkest life. As the sun set behind the horizon one evening, he stood once more at the window of his tower. The city glittered beneath him, alive and restless just as it had been when he was homeless. Only now he no longer looked at it as an outsider. He was part of its heartbeat, part of its growth, part of its story. He closed his eyes and whispered a promise to the boy he once was, that he would never forget, never stop giving, and never allow success to erase the lessons of struggle. He had risen from the pavement to the pinnacle, from invisibility to influence, from a man with nothing to a man with everything. But more than wealth, more than fame, he had built something far greater. He had built purpose, and that purpose would outlive him, shaping lives long after his name was forgotten.